Chapter 3.
Common Psychological Problems. Quote, "They don't really make plasters or band-aids for this stuff." End quote. Marianne. The painful part of the experience. Childhood traumatic events have negative impacts on a child, and these impacts tend to endure into the adult years. They do not simply disappear when an individual turns 18. Psychological symptoms can be thought of as the painful ways in which past trauma expresses itself today. As we shall see, the pain of past trauma can express itself through our emotional states, memories, thoughts, and our bodies. How symptoms express themselves within your life will be quite personal, but people who experience childhood harm often share similar experiences. We have worked with many people who can feel anxious about exploring this topic. Your experience of this material will be unique, but Terry's reaction is not unusual. Terry was emotionally and physically abused by his mother, and at the start of group therapy, he reflected on this chapter. Quote, "I was worried about reading this chapter because, well, what if I find out it's all worse than I thought? I've spent most of my life trying to believe I'm normal, trying to make people think I'm normal too. Reading this stuff, I'm like, yep, that's me. Yep, that's me too. It made me sad and sort of angry. But I also thought, okay, so maybe this is what happens if you don't feel safe when you're growing up." End quote. So it's possible that reading about psychological symptoms will stir up some difficult feelings. However, recognizing and acknowledging the impact of childhood harm can be important. As mentioned previously, Judith Herman suggests that, quote, "remembering and mourning," end quote, is a necessary part of recovery from childhood trauma. Herman is saying that being in touch with what happened and how it affected you will naturally evoke difficult emotions, sadness often being part of the experience. If recognizing the impact of childhood harm is upsetting, there are a couple of reasons this work can be helpful. First, the psychological symptoms you will explore here are common reactions to childhood harm. So, if you find yourself identifying with these issues, you are not alone. Terry understood this when he said, quote, but I also thought, okay, so this is what happens if you don't feel safe when you're growing up." End quote. A lot of people who experience childhood harm go through their adulthood years thinking, "I'm the problem." This chapter may help you appreciate that there is a more realistic way to look at things. It's not that you are the problem. Rather, you have problems. The problem is the childhood harm you experienced and its psychological impacts. So, understanding the common psychological symptoms associated with childhood harm can help normalize the difficulties you have. In other words, you may appreciate that it's normal, as in common, for people to experience a range of psychological symptoms as a consequence of childhood trauma. Second, understanding the unique impacts of childhood harm may help you feel a bit clearer about what you want to work on. Part 3 of the book will offer plenty of opportunities to focus on recovery or change. The issues you discover here will likely form a part of what recovery means for you. Recovering from trauma requires having some clarity about what you are recovering from. Painful psychological symptoms are only part of the story, but it's not something to overlook. The Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. Does childhood abuse or neglect have negative impacts on mental and physical health? The answer, as it turns out, is yes, it does. There are numerous studies supporting the link between historical trauma and a range of problems in later life, but the most comprehensive study ever conducted is the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. Over 25 years, more than 17,000 people in the San Diego area were studied with a view to understanding the connection between childhood trauma and difficulties in later life. If you want to understand the detail of this study, there's a website indicated at the end of the chapter you can access. Individuals who participated in the study filled out a 10-question survey, which allowed them to understand how many adverse childhood experiences they encountered. Adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, essentially refer to forms of childhood traumatic events. If you go to the site, you can complete the same survey and discover how many ACEs you experienced. There are individual differences, but on average, the more ACEs, answering yes to any question, an individual experiences, the greater the negative impact. A visit to the website provides much more detail, but some of the headlines from the ACE study are as follows. 1. Adverse childhood experiences were more common than expected, as seen by the fact that only 1/3 of respondents reported no ACEs. 2. The more ACEs a child experiences, the more likely they are to experience learning, emotional, or behavioral difficulties at school. 3. Higher ACE scores coincide with increased rates of depression, higher incidence of suicide attempts, alcohol and drug abuse, problems functioning at work, and financial difficulties, and increased risk of further traumatization in adult relationships. The point of mentioning the ACE study is not to depress or demotivate anybody. In fact, the message is quite the opposite. If you intuitively recognize that your childhood adverse experiences have put you at risk for psychological, relationship, or health problems, that's an important connection to make. You can begin to appreciate that your childhood experiences have set you up for such problems. The challenge now is to move in directions in which your childhood experiences have less impact on your well-being, health, and happiness. Below is a description of common psychological symptoms related to childhood trauma. Please note that the difficulty of shame is such a complex consequence of childhood trauma, it deserves its own chapter and will be discussed later in the guidebook. Anxiety difficulties. It makes sense that people with abuse histories are more likely to struggle with anxiety problems. We learn through our experiences whether the world is safe or filled with physical or emotional threats. If a child lives with fear because they are anticipating that physical, emotional, or sexual abuse is likely to occur, fear can become ingrained into their personality. It becomes a way of just going through life. Imagine two people. One has never had anything but pleasant driving experiences. Through no fault of their own, the other has been involved in 5 car accidents in which they were terrified and sustained physical injuries. These two people will think and feel very differently about driving. With childhood abuse, it was not a car accident that hurt you. It was another person or people. So many who experienced childhood harm tend to feel anxiety and mistrust toward others. Fear or anxiety can be experienced in several ways. It's normally felt in our bodies as an automatic reaction to thoughts or events. A pounding heart, racing thoughts, quick and shallow breathing, sweating or feeling hot, and so on. Another natural response to anxiety is to feel a need to avoid anything associated with the anxiety. You might want to avoid places such as shops, public transportation, or events. But it's not really places you want to avoid, it's people. Places are just where other people tend to be. People who are anxious also spend time scanning for danger or being on the lookout for threats. We call this hypervigilance. Hypervigilance makes it difficult to relax and enjoy others and our surroundings. Finally, those who experience childhood harm tend to quickly imagine that they are in danger or that something bad will occur. How they interpret events may be biased towards imagining a threat, often in situations where they are likely to be safe. How anxiety is experienced can vary. Some might struggle with panic attacks, some can have specific phobias, some worry a lot, and some might develop obsessive compulsive ways of coping. Human beings evolved to feel fear. It's a feeling meant to help us because it gets us to focus our attention in ways that will keep us or others safe. The problem for many people who experience childhood harm is that they may feel anxiety in situations where there is little or no danger. As a child, it made sense to feel scared as the threats were real. Perhaps there continue to be genuine threats in your life now, which may be something you need to pay attention to. However, for many, the legitimate fear they felt in childhood gets transferred onto many social situations today in ways which are not realistic. A good analogy is to a smoke alarm. If a smoke alarm is working properly, it will sound an alarm if there is a fire. If a smoke alarm is set in a manner that is too sensitive, it will sound an alarm when someone is cooking dinner. There is nothing fundamentally wrong with the smoke alarm. Its settings are just overly sensitive. As van der Kolk has written, the challenge is in, quote, repairing faulty alarm systems and restoring the emotional brain to its ordinary job of being a quiet background presence that takes care of the housekeeping of the body, ensuring you eat, sleep, connect with intimate partners, protect your children, and defend against danger. End quote. Exercise 1. Can you relate to the above description of anxiety difficulties? In what manner? Please pause the audio and complete Exercise 1 in the guidebook. Intrusive memories, flashbacks, and nightmares. You probably don't remember the experience of eating your lunch on June 17th, 2015. This is probably because the experience of eating lunch on that day wasn't likely to have been especially important. Memory is selective. Our brains evolved to store memories which are important to our survival and to forget less important memories. Events in which we felt seriously threatened or terrified, memories of abuse, are more likely to be strongly encoded in our memories. We may forget a memory for periods of time, but it can get triggered by a particular event. We can refer to this as an unwanted or intrusive memory. What triggers a memory of trauma can vary between people. It might be something you see on TV or hear on the radio. It might be hearing about someone from your past. But it's not just the memory that intrudes into your mind. Some old emotions and physical sensations come with it, so the memory can feel distressing. It's common for some to feel afraid of the memories and try to avoid situations that might trigger them. As one person we worked with said, quote, I never listen to the news, end quote. A flashback is a term which describes an intrusive memory which is so powerful it carries a lot of the original emotional charge. When people experience a flashback, they can momentarily lose contact with what's real. They might imagine that something bad is happening to them right now, even though no immediate threat exists. The past invades the present moment. Flashbacks are scary. Nightmares can be thought of as another way past trauma intrudes into our lives. We might be successful to some extent in suppressing traumatic memories during our waking lives, but they can express themselves within frightening dreams. The dreams may be very strange because the content of the trauma is presented symbolically. An important point is this: if you struggle with intrusive memories, flashbacks, or nightmares, this is a normal and understandable consequence of a traumatic past. We will work with these sorts of problems later in the program. Exercise 2. Are intrusive thoughts, flashbacks, or nightmares difficult for you? How so? Please pause the audio and complete exercise 2 in the guidebook. Anger. Anger is a natural and understandable reaction when we perceive that we have been mistreated or believe a situation is unjust. Anger can also be an immediate emotion which comes out in us when we feel threatened. Those who experience abuse or neglect were mistreated and have genuine reasons to feel that what happened to them was unfair or wrong. We find two things about anger that seem relevant for many people who experienced childhood harm. Anger is, one, a common reaction, but two, it's often a complicated feeling. Some could never feel angry at the person who was hurting them when they were younger. Perhaps being angry then would have been pointless or incurred even more danger. When you are not safe to express anger, either as a child or as an adult, the anger must express itself somehow. This can explain why anger can get directed inward at the self, perhaps through self punitive statements, deliberate self harm, or reckless behaviors. If anger is self directed, it can also be experienced as depression or can express itself through body based difficulties referred to as somatization. More about somatization in a moment. As adults, some can feel anger which is quite generalized. They might carry around anger or feel angry at the world. They sense that the anger they feel towards daily events is out of proportion, but it's hard to stop it. Angry fantasies may take up space in their minds. Their anger might be right beneath the surface, and it doesn't take much to set it off. Some may cope with powerful feelings of anger by occasionally dumping it onto others, and they may feel regret about this. People feel worn out by their anger. Exercise 3. Can you identify with the above description of anger? If so, in what manner? Please pause the audio and complete exercise 3 in the guidebook. Depression. It is not unusual for people who encountered childhood trauma to experience depression at various times in their lives. Depressive states can be characterized by dark moods, feelings of hopelessness, sadness, despair, a lack of interest, alienation, or pointlessness. And, as psychologist Dorothy Rowe has convincingly pointed out, a key component of depression is feeling cut off, feeling like you are in a bubble which separates you from others in life. Depression can be mixed with anxiety, anxious depression, or with anger and frustration, angry depression. But why are people who experienced abuse or neglect more vulnerable to depressive states? The answer to this question can be found in a simple idea. Our historical experiences deeply inform how we tend to see ourselves, others, and life. Consider an individual who did not experience childhood abuse or neglect. As they were growing up, they were loved, valued, protected, encouraged, and had good opportunities to play and learn. Their childhood experiences taught them that they have value, that relationships are safe and worthwhile, and that life holds interesting opportunities. As a consequence, they tend to look at themselves, others, and life in positive and hopeful ways. When life presents these individuals with hardships, which it will, a perspective of hope, positivity, and trust insulates them from depression or despair. The learning experiences of people who experience childhood harm tend to be different. What happened in childhood may have taught them that they are inadequate, that others cannot be trusted, that existence is a bad place where you are likely to get hurt or disappointed. Understandably, a dark or pessimistic perspective may develop. This perspective can be the source of vulnerability to depressive states, especially when life doesn't go well. However, there is no single cause for depression. A minority of people have a genetic predisposition to depression, which is true for a small number of people who experienced childhood harm. A psychoanalytic explanation for depression is that it results from not being able to access and express feelings of anger. And many who experienced abuse or neglect certainly have genuine reasons to feel anger. Another explanation for depression may relate to something a psychologist named Rollo May said. He described apathy as the last great defense. What he meant was that by not caring about my development, other people, or life, I can protect myself from hurt, disappointment, or abandonment. The defense mechanism works like this: I can't get hurt by something I don't care about, so I'm not going to care or hope for something. A lot of people we work with were truly hurt and let down by life and other people, so it's understandable that they might not hope or want for much. Experiencing apathy or indifference is a way of protecting ourselves from further disappointment or hurt, but it's also a recipe for depression. Exercise 4. Can you relate to the above description of depression, now or in the past? Please pause the audio and complete exercise 4 in the guidebook. Somatization. Somatization may or may not be a problem for you. However, somatization or psychosomatic problems are more common for people who experience trauma. Somatization occurs when psychological problems or past trauma gets expressed directly through our bodies. Examples of how psychological problems might express themselves physically can include gastrointestinal disturbance, e.g., IBS, chronic back or neck pain, muscular tension or spasms, migraine headaches, high blood pressure, chronic pain conditions, odd sensations such as trembling or shaking, frozen joints or limbs, loss of physiological feeling, etc. Physical expressions of unresolved past trauma can be very confusing, not only for people who experience them, but also for medical physicians. Sometimes when a physician can't determine a physical causation for a physical problem, they might refer to the issue as a medically unexplained symptom. If such problems are very pronounced or more chronic, the term functional neurological disorder, or FND, might be used. The exact mechanism whereby psychological or emotional problems are experienced as physiological issues is not entirely understood, but there are some fairly obvious clues. Muscle tension is likely to be one culprit. As van der Kolk suggests, quote, when people are chronically angry or scared, constant muscle tension ultimately leads to spasms, back pain, migraine headaches, fibromyalgia, and other forms of chronic pain. End quote. Also, the release of stress hormones into our bloodstream very likely plays a role. The experience of threat can be real or imagined, happening right now, or connected to memories. It's all the same to our brain and body because any perception of threat releases hormones like adrenaline and cortisol. Adrenaline will increase heart rate and blood pressure. The release of cortisol will increase sugar in the bloodstream and switch off systems not immediately needed for survival, such as the digestive and reproductive systems. If the release of adrenaline and cortisol happens occasionally and for brief periods, our physiology is unlikely to be disturbed. However, recall that one of the common features of CPTSD is a generalized experience of threat, which of course connects to emotions such as fear or anger. If you are walking around for much of the day swimming in a soup of your own stress hormone, it makes sense that this will eventually get expressed through any number of medical complaints. It's important to make a couple of points here. First, if you have a history of trauma and some physical problems, it doesn't necessarily mean that past trauma is causing the physical problem. Your physical problems might have a very real physical causation, i.e., your back pain is caused by an actual injury. However, in some instances, the past trauma is being expressed through pain or other bodily problems. Or perhaps there is some underlying physical difficulty, but a traumatic past worsens the experience of a physical problem. Second, if your past trauma expresses itself through your body, it doesn't mean that the physical problem is, quote, all in your head, end quote. With somatization, your experience of pain or other physical difficulties is very real. It's just not being caused by physical illness, disease, or impairment. The underlying cause of the physical problem is psychological. Exercise 5. Somatization may or may not be relevant to you. What do you think? Please pause the audio and complete exercise 5 in the guidebook. Emotional dysregulation. Children who experience trauma are introduced to experiences of threat and fear, and they often lack supportive adults who can soothe those painful emotional experiences. Consequently, people who experience childhood harm can be quite emotionally reactive to stressors, e.g., bad news, criticism, or a perception of threat. Some might react to a stressful event by feeling flooded by strong or overwhelming emotions, or they might deal with the situation by shutting down emotionally or feeling numb. In other words, emotional reactions can be so strong that some lack confidence that they can regulate or control them. Emotionally dysregulated states are often really problematic because some people can become afraid of their own emotional lives. Painful states of emotional dysregulation are not the fault of people who experienced childhood harm. These states are a common consequence of being exposed to genuine threats in childhood and lacking stable and caring people who can consistently soothe those states. We focus specifically on emotion regulation later in the guidebook. Exercise 6. Can you identify with the idea of emotional dysregulation? In other words, are there times when you feel overwhelmed by powerful emotions, or emotionally cut off, or numb? Please pause the audio and complete Exercise 6 in the guidebook. Dissociation. Dissociation is something we all do to a degree. It refers to a strategy where we cope by shutting off or tuning out from feelings or situation. You can spot it in other people when their gaze loses focus. They're not connected anymore. They've gone somewhere else. Dissociation is a way of coping so we don't get overwhelmed by a situation. However, because people who experienced childhood harm were exposed to more threats and fear, they are more likely to develop a pattern of dissociating in order to shut off from dangers or emotional pain. This was an understandable means of coping when you were being hurt. Dissociation is the experience of being detached from the world, other people, your feelings or physiological sensations. It's being numb or spaced out. Dissociation is the opposite of being present, of feeling the wind on your face, hearing the sounds around you, and being able to listen and connect to others. Dissociation occurs along a continuum from mild, i.e., daydreaming while driving, to more severe, i.e., having little awareness of external events or feelings and having no memory of recent events. If you sense that what is happening isn't real, this is called derealization. If you have the sense that what is happening isn't really happening to you, this is called depersonalization. Derealization and depersonalization are just particular expressions of dissociation. Dissociation can be a problem because what started in childhood as a way of coping can end up separating us from our feelings, others, or life. Exercise 7. Can you identify with this description of dissociation? In what manner? Please pause the audio and complete Exercise 7 in the guidebook. The human family. Many people who experience childhood harm can feel like they don't belong. I'm odd, I don't fit in, there is something really wrong with me, I'm just so different. Why can't I cope like other people? Reynold, a 35-year-old who experienced abuse and periods of abandonment, put it like this, quote, I can have this weird fantasy that a spaceship arrives, and they get out and explain that I'm an alien. I'm like, excellent, let's go. It's sort of funny, but I feel sad about it too. End quote. In recent chapters, we explored universal human needs and common psychological symptoms. And before we end, it's important to emphasize the connection between these topics. People who experienced childhood trauma are often different from those who did not. The difference usually is experienced through the impact that trauma and the lack of an enduring and safe relationship in childhood had. In other words, people who encounter childhood trauma are much more likely to experience painful psychological symptoms. However, people who experience childhood trauma are absolutely a part of the human family because they have the same universal human needs as everybody else. If we only think about psychological symptoms, we miss the bigger picture. Of course, people who are abused will experience problems with anxiety because their universal need for basic safety went unmet. If you are uncared for or abandoned, of course you will struggle with anxiety, depression, or dissociation because your universal needs for belonging or a secure sense of self were not attended to. There are many connections between painful psychological symptoms and unmet needs which can be drawn, and you will have further opportunities to do this as we go along. So, there are two takeaway points here. One, despite your unique and painful experiences, you are very much a part of the human family in respect to universal human needs. Reynolds' quip about feeling like an alien was humorous, but neither Reynold nor anyone who experienced childhood harm is an alien. 2. If you want to make progress concerning painful psychological symptoms, you will need to look at how needs went unmet in childhood and how they remain unmet today. Getting universal human needs met reasonably well is an unavoidable feature of recovery. This is the end of the chapter on common psychological problems.